Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are, and welcome to Free Thought Hour. Well, it's nice to be back. I'm still not getting used to it because doing that again. Shouldn't be doing. Ah, we have an echo. Let me just take down that there. Sorry, that was me. Yeah, won't do that again. Anyway, it is nice to be back, and I'm still not getting used to it because we had such a long break over the festive season. But we do have my co-host, Tercia. How the devil are you? Oh, you're frozen. What's going on? Hmm. Uh, I think I might. Let's see if I can get my guest. Can I hear him? Philip?
Hello.
Ah, we can hear you. So, what's happened to Tercia? Philip, welcome. Anyway,
Thank you.
yeah, I'm going to ask Tercia to come back because yeah, she's gone. Her connection broke. Anyway,
Oh,
yeah, it happens, especially in South Africa where they have power cuts.
gotcha.
The electricity supply is not very reliable. Anyway, we've got you. So, Philip, welcome to the show.
Thank you
And
very much.
good. So, I'm going to introduce you a little bit because I met you in the usual way on social media. I think it was probably on Facebook,
Yeah.
and and what usually happens when I'm looking for guests is I meet somebody in some thread, where there's a discussion going on, and,
hmm
and I see what their comments are like, and think, here's an interesting person. could, could I invite him to be a guest on our show? And I think that's what happened with you. So,
Awesome.
so was it Facebook where we met?
Yeah, there was this guy. The thread is still kind of ongoing. This guy making a bunch of really canned apologetic
Yeah.
responses, and like I was raised Christian from a very early age,
Yeah.
and I sort of deconverted in my mid 20s, and by then I had access to all kinds of like stuff on the internet,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
already had a pretty good working knowledge of scripture
Mm.
and the Bible through an evangelical lens
Yeah. Yeah.
in terms of
So,
interpretation.
yeah. So I want to ask you a little bit more about that. Ideally, when Tercia gets her devices connected, because at the moment she's not managed to get her camera and microphone active. But
Oh
yeah, I understand that you had why it was Pentecostal, wasn't it? The
yes, we started out Assembly of God,
mm,
and we ended up going from there to there was all kinds. Yeah, I ended up I didn't really take Christianity super seriously until I was in my mid-teens. Though we were
uh-huh,
living in Cottage Grove, Oregon, and at the time I was going to a church called Evangel Temple Christian Fellowship, and it ended up being renamed multiple times. But
yeah,
Evangel Temple is a major Pentecostal cult, and
hmm
you don't really a lot of churches that used to have that name kind of have since changed their name. I think they're
yeah.
kind of distancing themselves from that because
Really? Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know the Pentecostal movement might be sort of in decline. Is that?
well, yeah, it basically it's one of those where non-denominational Pentecostals are one of the biggest. But like I was watching a YouTube video by I forget what it's called. It's basically they do charts, and they explain the data in the charts.
Yeah,
And
uh-huh,
one of the charts was basically about Christian denominations.
yeah,
And essentially, if you stuck to legitimate denominations, Pentecostals aren't even really on the list. But if
uh,
you lump all non-denominational Pentecostals together as their own pseudo denomination, they
yeah,
kind of outnumber a lot of the other evangelical sects.
Outnumber
It
the
looks like
officials.
Tercia's back.
Welcome, Tercia. You've made it. Hello.
I hope. Sorry about that. I don't know what's happening. I don't know. Let's see how it goes.
Gremlins. Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
supplicate the internet gods.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I just heard about your being raised in a Pentecostal community and being a member of some, I dare say, weird sort of non-denominational Pentecostal congregation.
Yeah.
So I caught that.
Yeah, it was very cultish.
Yeah, he used the word cult, which, people who subscribe to a denomination don't usually describe themselves in that way. But it's interesting. Yeah.
Basically, the difference between a cult and a church is usually membership and numbers and how long they've been in operation. There was definitely a time, in the first decade of the Common Era where Christianity was definitely a cult. They had, they didn't even have denominations. They had entirely different sects of Christianity, from like the Essenes to the Sethians, to other Gnostic sects that believed that the God of the Old Testament was actually an evil demon. Which, if it read from that lens, that actually resonates with a lot of people. Like, I'm watching a lot of YouTube material on the subject, like via Justin Sledge's excellent channel Esoterica. He goes into a lot of detail about. Also, Phillip Holm has a channel called Let's Talk Religion. That's super good about that kind of stuff too. It's really good to learn a lot about this stuff. But Christianity has been a cult. It's been a world religion, and that's pretty much how world religions start, is as cults.
It's interesting that you mention these channels because they're very US based. We don't have this problem in Europe or in South Africa. We don't need to start channels to talk about religion because it's pretty much died out.
Right. Well, the US is definitely. Sorry, go ahead.
I want to say that in South Africa we do need channels like that. We are still a step behind the United States in that we don't have channels discussing these things, because in South Africa cults are, in my opinion, on the rise, because we have hundreds of very large non-denominational independent churches, especially amongst the African communities, where they have an extremely toxic blend of traditional African beliefs and all weird varieties of Christianity, where there are regular incidents of animal mutilations, so-called raising people from the dead miracles. It's actually quite crazy in South Africa. John, no, we need the channels in South Africa. we definitely.
Right.
Okay. Point taken. I don't represent South Africa. I don't represent anybody except me, really.
Well, I don't represent South Africa. I just know what's happening here on the front.
Yeah. So you were raised, Phil. You were raised in. It seems like quite a fundamental family community. Yes. And so how did you escape from that? What happened?
Well, so in the United States, ever since I think the mid 20th century, there was a huge push to prevent there being multi-generational family households, right? And if you look back towards the past of humans in general, we used to do communal child rearing almost exclusively, where everybody's kids were all kind of raised together. There was no real concept of preschool or anything like that.
Yeah, that's right. So it's interesting sociologically, because I'm aware from seeing American TV shows that were imported here.
Yeah.
In the concept of the nuclear family, I'm thinking of things like what is it? Loves Lucy. Des,
Right.
Desi Loves Lucy. I can't remember the name of the
Yes,
show.
I Love Lucy, and it
Oh,
starred Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball Arnaz when they
that's
were
right.
still
Yeah,
married.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And it was very much sort of one woman, one wife, one husband, and some kids, and
yeah,
it was there wasn't a lot of access to grandparents, aunts and uncles. You know, the
yeah.
extended family was sort of missing. I didn't
Right.
realize there was a sort of push towards that in America. Tell us
Well,
about.
if you think about it from the perspective of like capitalistic profit motive, okay,
Hmm.
houses and cars are expensive,
Yeah,
and if you convince your working populace to always leave home when they come of age, then you get to sell every new family
yeah,
another car and another house.
yeah,
And the original solution to that was just to have three generations of people in the same family all living under one roof,
yeah, yeah,
even
yeah.
if it wasn't necessarily all in one big house. There was like a complex you could have,
Yeah.
and like in Europe 1,000 years ago, this was extremely common back when they were doing the
Yes.
wild hunts. They'd have the adolescent boys were not capable of really pulling their weight, so they'd get kicked out into the forest where they would,
Yeah.
grow dreadlocks and wear horns in their hair and be bandits for 6 or 7 years before they got their proverbial S together and were able to either return to the village or become professional Vikings. You know,
Hmm.
that sort of thing was extremely common back then. And I'm not necessarily suggesting kicking our adolescent kids out and letting them form roving bands of bandits, but like, we certainly don't need every person in a household owning their own motor vehicle. Those things, the more of them there are, like, yeah, a single car is relatively safe. You don't tend to look at it from a macro perspective. But if you talk about the invention of the automobile and all of the people who have died because of cars, because of being hit by cars, because of drunk driving, I didn't mean to turn this into an anti-car rant, but like, yeah, like those things are expensive. The oil industry has an iron grip on everything, so they convinced people to just completely atomize their families. And so when that happened, I got internet access, and that was when I began to really doubt my Christian faith.
Right. That's entirely novel thought to me. I mean, it makes a lot of sense from a commercial point of view. You want
Yeah,
more customers, and if
exactly.
you can divide up multi-layered families into single-layered families, that meets your need as a business.
Exactly. You've got family wealth going wide instead of tall, as it were.
Yes, yes,
Oh,
yes.
that
And
is a
but then
very interesting observation. Never thought
Mm.
about.
Yeah. But yeah, after leaving home, that kind of brought my disability into much sharper relief in terms of my neurodivergence and comorbidities, because I had a lot of trauma outside of the church too, like, war criminal Vietnam vet stepdad who had a bit of a torture fetish. I'm not going to get into any graphic detail, but like that kind of stuff, especially on a bright young neurodivergent mind, tends to have a way of radicalizing you before your time.
You're a vet? Are you a vet?
I am not. I didn't. I once had sort of aspired to be like in the Air Force or something like that,
Mm.
because I was a pretty smart kid, and that was what I was told. If you were smart, you went to the Air Force. If you were
Yeah,
dumb,
yeah,
you
yeah.
went to like the Army or the
Mm.
Marines. But like, yeah, I lost all taste for
The military.
U.S. empire just because of I have a pretty strong sense of justice and empathy, and I see a lot of
Mm.
crimes being done by the U.S. military, and
Mm.
it covering the entire world, even in terms of like the climate crisis, right? Like the U.S.
Hmm.
military is like they have to hide the numbers for how big of a polluter the U.S. military is,
Yeah, yeah.
because if those numbers were known, it would basically become, well, and actually, in my opinion, it would be to the world's benefit if the U.S. really scaled back its military, both in terms of
Yeah,
raw numbers and the amount of money we shove into it. Because we've got bridges collapsing here, and they're just really trying to force more people to give birth so they can keep the working class and
Mm.
and the military just flush with new blood, because in America the working class is only worth what they can provide the elites. They don't actually have any inherent value as human beings.
Ooh, yeah. I can see why that's a
I
strong point of view. Yeah.
I can imagine that you must be going through a bit of a hard time emotionally with the recent events because
Yes,
in your country, because I'm in South Africa and I'm going through a hard time.
right.
Um, I
Really sorry about Elon Musk coming from your country, by the way.
Yeah, sorry about that. We have to take responsibility for that. You can't blame Trump on us.
Yeah,
That's your own fault.
exactly. He's way more of an American now than he is a South African, as far as I'm concerned. He's got all the
I
greed,
think
all the money.
this
well,
is this is
one
this is
good
odd
reason.
because for once I'm not getting the blame.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But yeah,
so it's interesting your observations about the military-industrial complex, and
yeah,
also I'm reading between the lines.
Okay, I'm
Maybe I'm
interested.
reading something that isn't there. The
Mm.
idea of capitalism. Would you? So I'm quite a harsh critic of capitalism. I
yeah.
think the way I wouldn't describe myself as a communist by any means, uh, especially because I think the labels communism, capitalism, socialism have become so. I don't think people really know
The
what
well is
those.
severely poisoned.
Yeah, it has been.
Yeah,
Yes.
Yeah,
um, but I find it interesting that there's a strong link between um, the cult of MAGA, and
yeah,
capitalism, and Elon Musk, and it's a very powerful beast. So I'm in South Africa, as I've mentioned, and
right.
what strikes me, especially in this past week, I've been in many conversations on Facebook with South Africans, many of them atheists, and I was severely criticised for posting about the what I regard as Elon Musk making the Sig Heil, the Nazi salute,
Yeah,
at the inauguration, and I have been pulled apart. I mean, the amount of personal insults, the vitriol by white South Africans, Christians as well as atheists, who absolutely adore the Trump Musk cult.
Yeah.
So this,
right.
and I've just read an interesting article by a journalist who spent at least 5 years living in Dallas as a correspondent for Reuters, and he makes a strong link between the religious right that has now completely been fused with this um, the cult of MAGA, which is also a kind of capitalist cult, and
Yeah,
and and it's really infiltrated the whole world. It's really dangerous. I think we sort of on the brink of I'm not sure what, but I don't think it's
right.
I don't think it's going to be good. So how does that make you feel? How do you cope? Just on a little bit of a more emotional level. Do you
Well,
struggle with anxiety or stress? I
yeah.
do.
There's a lot to say on that subject. Being neurodivergent, and also I'm kind of like demisexual and non-binary. Basically, and this is pretty common with autistic people, our relationship to gender and sexuality tends to be almost as unique as ourselves. And
Okay, so but Philip, you have now been declared illegal because Trump made an
Yeah.
order that there's only two genders. So are you
exactly,
aware? Are you
and
aware of that?
yeah, he accidentally made it to where everyone in the U.S. is female because he's talking about gametes at the time of conception, and
Yeah.
because every human being is a female at the time of conception, and then they gain their other primary sexual characteristics later. Like
Yes.
that. That's why they have to wait until the later ultrasound before they can even determine the sex of the child in utero, because it's not just unknown, it's probably unknowable when they're before a certain age.
Yeah. According to embryology, we all grow up the same,
Right.
and until I don't know how many weeks into gestation, when the male hormone takes over and turns the early developing female potential body into a male body.
Right. And there's actually villages, like in the global south, where it's just a trait that there's like a sort of preliminary puberty in which half the girls of the village become boys. Like they literally grow the parts and stuff like that. It just happens much later than in utero.
Ooh,
And
that's interesting.
yeah,
I want a reference for that.
yeah, I'm definitely gonna have to pull that up.
I've read about. I've read articles about that. Yes, it's especially like in the globe. When you say global south, I do know there's one particular village in somewhere in South America. I'm not sure where, but I've read about that. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I would. I didn't actually come with a link prepared for that one because it just sort of came up in the conversation. But yeah. But even then, like sex and gender are not the same thing, and so gender identity, by virtue of being your identity, it's part of your psychological and social profile, which exists in what part of your body? Your brain.
Yes.
And so you don't look between someone's legs to find their identity any more than you look there to find their liver. Right. And so me being queer, a lot of my friends who are also neurodivergent and queer, they're absolutely scared to death right now. There's a lot of basically solidarity and mutual aid stuff. You were talking about how a lot of these labels aren't really that useful. I'm basically an anarchist, but I'm an anti-capitalist anarchist. A lot of people think that anarchists are obligately pro-capital, but that's a relatively new invention. Murray Rothbard reinventing the word libertarian to mean something.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
it used to. Yeah.
And anarchy used not to belong to libertarians, but now,
right.
Yeah.
And anarchism is not just burning everything down. It's more about building structures from the ground up to allow people their own self-governance, and understanding that working class people specifically have so much power when we put our hands together. Like, it's funny because a lot of historians will look back to the end of egalitarianism as a major turning point for the human race, when droves of people were enslaved and forced at basically sword point to build massive monuments for their egotistical leadership. But humans have had the capacity to build stuff like that all along. We don't need whips and swords to get us to do that. We just need solidarity, united purpose.
Cooperate. Absolutely.
Right. And so anarchism is essentially the idea that if you build a society from the ground up around meeting the basic needs of the worker, that basically you can't approach liberty without also having it be in the socioeconomic dimension, right? Social liberty is meaningless if you can't afford a roof over your head. Then you're free to freeze to death. And I was homeless for 3 years as a result of my mental illness issues. And
where was that, Bill?
That was from 2016 to 2019. I spent a year and a half of it in a mission and another year and a half of it in a tent in a sanctioned camp, where they basically were floating the idea of running tent camps, and they gave us the absolute bare minimum they possibly could as a test. And so that was the last. This was in Eugene, Oregon, on the west coast of the United States.
Yeah. Because you're not there now, are you?
No, I've gotten into subsidized housing. I was able to get, housed through a program here in the area called Homes for Good, and it's been a real game changer for me. It's helped me out a lot. I met a lot of people while I was homeless. One of them ended up basically being almost a father figure. He's a
Yeah.
little bit more able to work,
Hmm.
right? He basically, the reason he ended up homeless in the first place is because he had lost his fortune to an identity theft attack and lost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then didn't, took what little money he had left and went and got drunk in Louisiana, and then somehow ended up back in Oregon where he ended up homeless. This was a guy that had worked for the government. He had worked for
Yeah.
oil making companies. Yeah.
So you're not in Oregon now, are you?
No, I'm still in Oregon. I'm just I'm in the same county, but I'm in a smaller town to the south of where I was homeless.
Hmm.
Yeah, because housing came up here before it would have come up there. Go ahead, Terzia. It looks like you want to ask something.
Yes, yes. I've watched a number of documentaries about homelessness in America, and it's a major problem where I live as well. So I'm in the Western Cape in South Africa, and I've often wanted to actually interview. I have done some conversations with some of the people that live on the streets, but the lived experience of being homeless is something that fascinates me, and in particular, in a first world country, I have seen documentaries that indicate that it's a massive problem in the United States and growing. And to speak to somebody who lived that is really something that I don't think people who have somebody like me who's never lived on the streets, but I have had conversations with people who live on the streets. I think we have so little idea of what it's like. And something I just mentioned to a friend of mine the other day who made a comment about somebody begging on the street. And I said, I don't think we realize what a privilege it is to be able to bath, to be clean,
Yeah.
to not to walk in to walk past somebody and not worry about your body odor.
Yeah.
And what that does to your experience of human dignity. And there are so many things in society that have gone wrong and do go wrong. And I think sometimes we want to address these problems with big things like, give people housing. But if I think of my community, I think just having a place where you can go in safety to have a decent shower and have access to a place where you can wash your clothes so that you can at least look presentable when you interact with other individuals. So, what is your response to that, Philip?
Well, being homeless, I don't know about other countries, but here in the United States, the mere fact of being homeless drains. I don't really believe in souls, but I think if you did have a soul, being homeless would basically drain everything out of you. You would be left with basically nothing. Talking about access to showers and stuff like that, that's definitely a thing. A lot of people don't realize that half of all homeless people work, and of those, half of those work full time. And it's not so simple to just get a job and then instantly you're no longer homeless, because the housing market here, I don't know how expensive monthly rents are where y'all live, but I can't really be bothered to do exchange rates, but like we have like single bedroom apartments up here for like $1,200 a month, 1,200 American dollars a month, and that's several times what a lot of people can afford.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And a lot of the recent rash of homelessness here in Lane County in Western Oregon, a lot of those homeless people were literally made homeless either because they lost their job in the pandemic and then could no longer pay rent and got evicted. And the worse the climate catastrophe, if there's another pandemic that goes through, it's not just the homeless that are going to be really vulnerable, although they always are the most vulnerable whenever something like that happens, but also people who are a paycheck away from being homeless themselves, because a lot of
Yeah.
them will be homeless within a month or two.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
We,
sorry, go ahead.
we've had a couple of documentaries here. One about the situation in LA, where there's roads of tents,
Yeah.
especially under flyover arches and so on.
Hmm.
And in this country, we've had a documentary focusing on a businessman who, like your example, lost everything and ended up on a park bench.
Yeah.
And but has since become, he's managed to get back to it, to what you might call civilization.
Yeah.
It's it's a disaster that could happen to pretty much anyone.
Yeah, it's definitely true. It basically, as long as if you have any like vectors of economic vulnerability, like for instance, if you have, let's say, a chronic illness, or if you're black or queer, or if you're indigenous, the more different kinds of vulnerable you are, intersectionally speaking, the more likely you are to end up homeless.
Yeah,
And once you're on the street as like a queer person of color, for example, your experience being homeless is going to be an absolute nightmare, even in
yeah,
comparison to a white dude like me.
yeah,
And
yeah,
a couple statistics for you: half of homeless people were foster children that aged out
mm,
and
yeah,
ended
yeah.
up on the street as a consequence. And so a lot of these people never actually had the opportunity to grow and develop into an adult. If your brain is steeped in cortisol from an early age,
Yes, yes, yes,
at that point trauma becomes a developmental disability, even though it's not
yes,
really classified as such. And that's the life that a lot of they call it shit life syndrome, basically. The
yeah.
more different intersecting ways that life is hard for you, the more likely you are to end up, you know,
I'm sure
homeless,
you're.
addicted.
We have a system here in the UK, which I was briefly involved in as a teacher at a boarding school for the specially, what were they called? EBD, emotionally and behaviorally disturbed children.
Yeah.
And it's okay while they're at school. They're institutionalized. They're in a society, a culture where everything is provided and there's expectations and regulations. And then at the end of their schooling, they're chucked out.
Right. And where do they go? What do they do?
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And
Uh,
sorry, go ahead, Sergio.
go ahead. No, go ahead. Okay,
Um,
I'll say this. I in conversations like this and thinking about the responses I get from family members and friends when we have these types of conversations, I'm constantly um, forced to revert to the fact, what I regard as a fact at least, that we have very little to no choice at all. And
mhm.
since we've talked about anarchism and we've talked about communism and anti-capitalism, do you think that as individuals we have a choice? And the reason I want to ask you this is because I think the way we structure, as long as we structure society, that people can choose. So if you're homeless, you've made wrong choices, and that's why you're ending up homeless. That's the societal idea. So
Right.
you just have to make choices in life, and then your life will get better. And I'm of the opinion, as long as we have that basis of thinking how we treat people, very little will change. I
Hmm.
think things will only begin to change when the people in society who have the ability due to their economic circumstances, the way their brains develop, who have the ability to realize what happens to you is determined by your biological and your environmental circumstances. Then we will begin to put to restructure our society without this idea that people are on the streets because they just made wrong choices. What's your response to that? And I think you are particularly qualified since you've lived that experience.
Right. So there's a lot of systemic issues that go into what causes people to become homeless. I can't really speak on behalf of others, but for me, a lot of it was, so 85% of autistic adults struggle with getting and keeping work, and it's usually about burnout. And pretty much everybody experiences burnout, but autistic people experience a uniquely hellish form of it. And if your brain is essentially like if your nervous system is damaged from a lot of, for instance, childhood trauma, and if you're never given the opportunity to rest, and I mean really rest, like deliberately making yourself not think about work, like deliberately laying down and forcing yourself to do literally nothing, that the kind of rest that is healthy, but it's the really boring kind. But that's the only way to get out of that kind of burnout. But yeah, when your nervous system is just fried like that, and you have to deal with burnout, a lot of times it just gets easier to quit your job. And like I had this sort of thing I would do. This was before the 2008 recession. After that, it was no longer possible. But I would pick up a temp gig for like 3 or 4 months, save up a couple $1,000s, and my rent was cheap at the time. It was only like 600 USD a month, which is really, really cheap. We haven't had rent that cheap in a really long time.
Yeah.
And so I would basically save up a few $1,000s and live off that until I, had like one month of rent and a couple weeks of groceries left, and then I would just go back to the temp agency and have another gig in 2 days. And after 2008, that disappeared entirely.
Right up. Yeah.
When you have a big economic recession like that, what happens is people who are hiring are only picking the absolute best candidates. And if you're an autistic person who's been having burnout for 15 years at the time, I'm in my mid-20s and I've already had 15 years of burnout under my belt, right? Because it started early. Like I was still in elementary school when I started experiencing burnout. But yeah, like you're not going to be on the short list of people who
No.
And so after the recession ends, now those standards are pretty much set in stone, and you will never meet them again.
Yeah.
And so it gets even harder. And the older you get, and the more gaps you have in your resume or CV or whatever, the harder you get to hire. Unless you're actually doing it through like a firm that literally just handles disabled people or people who
specialize
homelessness. At that point, if you're going to get a job, you're pretty much going to kind of have to have one tailored for you, because
that's right. And
especially for me being an anarchist, I couldn't be productive as a Walmart greeter. Okay. That combines 3 different layers of hell for me simultaneously. I'm wearing shoes all day, I'm standing all day, I'm talking to people all day, and I'm doing it to line the pockets of billionaires. There's nothing about that job that appeals to me.
That would be a nightmare for you.
Oh, yeah, exactly. And so, go ahead.
So if you could design society to your liking, what would it look like, Phillip?
It would look a lot like solar punk anarchism, where it's basically adjudicated from the ground up with the needs of the workers in mind. Walkable cities, replace 90% of motor vehicles with a really nice monorail that's about 500 feet off the ground, so it doesn't disturb the walking people. And
On that subject, today I was driving in London, and it was ludicrous the speed that I was doing it. I was mostly parked with the engine running, and
yeah,
the sat nav was telling me that I had 2 miles to my destination, and it was going to take 21 minutes. You
yeah.
know, I
You would
could
have
have
been
walked
better
it.
off getting out of your car and
Yeah,
riding a bicycle to your
yeah,
destination.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm,
And
Yeah,
so, like, a lot of that stuff just disappears. Sorry,
that's
go
a
ahead,
very
Ruthia. I see
interesting.
your mouth moving.
mm.
No, it's interesting. I saw a documentary. I don't remember now. I think I shared it. Where the whole premise was that we need to redesign our cities so that the inner city is a walking space, and it showed how the whole idea of everybody must have a car, and that brings back to what you said right at the beginning. It's this whole capitalist thing. Everybody must have a car. So how the need to have a car transformed cities so that the suburbs moved out of and city centres became these bustling areas built for cars, and then parking is a problem. So now you build parking spaces, and there was an example of a Canadian city, and it has a sister city in the Netherlands.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah.
And how in the 70s the Dutch city decided to turn the inner city into a pedestrian space,
Yep, yep.
and
Yeah.
whereas the Canadian city didn't. And the difference today in those two cities and in the lived experience of people in those two cities
Hmm.
is it's vast. And the Dutch city is a much more vibrant, more creative, safer, happier space than the one that was centered around motor vehicles.
Yes.
So yeah, that's really interesting. This whole idea. So maybe I watched a snippet of QI, the British show. John Stephen Fry was the QI. I don't know if it's still running, but
Yeah,
um,
yeah, it is. He stepped down from chairing it, from hosting it, and it's more
yeah,
recently been hosted by Sandy Toksvig.
that's right. Yeah, yeah.
Yes,
But
yes.
there was this snippet last night where when motor cars just were invented, and there was a there was a society in America called the Anti-Motor Vehicle Society, and they were huge, and they had laws well, they proposed laws such as
Yeah.
cars have to be dismantled, not to so you have to pull off the road, and you have to cover your car with it's like a camouflage tarpaulin, not to scare the horses in the back. It's hilarious. And those guys had a point, it seems.
They
Well, yeah,
did.
when cars first arrived in the UK, we had a law that said, in order to make it safe for the population, any car had to be preceded by a man walking with a warning red flag.
Ha. Nice.
Oh yeah, it's so interesting how we paint ourselves into all sorts of corners as a species. And I
Mm,
think we're going for the worst of all corner with climate change at the moment. But
mm.
yeah, maybe it all started with cars, eh?
Yeah.
Well, I want to ask Phil, why did you leave Christianity? What was it turned you off?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions. If you read the scriptures with even a little bit of a critical eye, a lot of them just jump out at you, you know. But even more so than that, a lot of it was the incongruity between the behavior of the people around me and the beliefs that they were openly espousing.
Yeah.
I
Mm,
felt like a lot of them were just cynically exploiting their religion to gain power over other people.
yeah.
And that, you know, I was just earlier I was referring to my sense of moral justice. That doesn't fly with me. I'm not really, you know, into people who exploit others as you
Yeah.
know, their primary line of work.
Okay, so where did you get your sense of moral justice from, Phil?
Well,
Because
that
you know
that
what
might
they
be just
claim.
yeah,
They
that
claim
might be an autism thing because it's actually pretty common that autistic people often have a very clear cut and very well developed moral compass.
well,
And
yes, but where's it from? Because the the Christians, particularly, will tell you. I call them fromists
yeah,
because
yeah.
they say that it comes from their God, and I disagree. So you tell us
Yeah.
what you.
Well, yeah, like if you look at morality from a bird's eye perspective, there are so and Aaron Ra is fond of making this argument too. But a lot of people love to pretend that all morality is God given. But if you were to practice the morality in the Bible, you would be arrested within 2 weeks, probably.
You would, yes.
Yeah, because yeah, like let's say you decide to go to war against your neighbor because over a property line dispute. If you show up to the judge with his foreskin, you're in trouble. You know, in the Bible, that's just normal, but like in real life, that's an issue you're going to have to work out with the authorities and probably the aggrieved man who has now been circumcised against his will.
Yeah.
I can I can imagine that. Well, um, so I, if I can answer your question, John, I think you and I, at least, and I think Phil will probably agree that morality is an evolutionary byproduct
Mm.
of our being a social species, and the fact
Yes.
that it is so clear that even animals have a sense of fairness, and I think
Yes.
if one
They
goes
do.
down, then morality is just the ability to see that something is fair or not fair. And I
Yeah.
just always see the image of the two capuchin monkeys, and they perform the same task, and the one is given a grape, and the other one is given a slice of cucumber. And how the one that's given the slice of cucumber just looks at the one with the grape, and he just
Yes.
tosses that cucumber through the cage back at the handler. Because
Yes.
what the hell? This is not fair. We did the same
Yes.
thing, and I got
Yeah.
a cucumber,
Yes.
and
Yes.
the other one got a grape. And I think
Yes.
that's where our morality comes from.
Yeah.
Right.
Well.
Morality to me feels like an emergent property, and because humans are gregarious altricial apes, right? We come from the womb needing extensive care for several years before we're even ready to be semi-autonomous, but we're still vulnerable that whole time. I don't think in the ancient times kids could learn to help with the hunting and gathering from a relatively young age, but they weren't at optimal performance at all until they hit
Well,
young adulthood, right?
but even prelingual babies
Yeah,
go outrage when they see unfairness being practiced in front of.
correct. And
Yep.
so basically going forward from the whole being gregarious apes thing, we see behaviors in our fellows that we like and wish to emulate, behaviors that we see make us and others feel good and are more pro-social. And we see behaviors that are the antithesis of that, and we decide that we want to exemplify the good pro-social behaviors and not the evil antisocial behaviors. No God required. And the thing of it is if you look at morality as something that develops forth from a society, it's going to change over time. So
Yeah.
biblical morality does not change over time. Regular morality changes over time, and then people claiming at having biblical morality are now being forced to lie
Yes.
because
Yes.
they have the same moral basis that we do. It's essentially more of a societal and sociocultural thing.
Yeah.
And of course, moral fiber is definitely something you have within yourself. Even back during the time when slavery was in vogue, there were still, philosophers and whatnot at the time that were contemporary to that, saying, "No, this is wrong. Those are human beings."
Yes.
There's always been that, modern morality, if you want to call it that. Bits and pieces of it have always existed, but You know, a lot of the ideas like, hey, you can't just go owning another human being. And once again, bringing that back to profit motive, enslaving another human only really makes sense in feudalism or capitalism.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because in an anarchist system, you don't need to enslave anyone. Everyone is basically, they have, you know, they signed their community agreement to make sure not to mess with each other's kids. And other than that, they get their job, they provide for their community as a whole as though it were their own family. And in return, they get provided for. Everybody wins. But like, whenever you introduce, you know, profit motive and vertical hierarchies, you also invite the vast potential for that to turn neglectful and abusive. And it always, that neglect and abuse always hits the lower rungs of society first, the working class, the disabled, you know.
You've got a bit of a problem selling anarchism, though, because to the average person, it tends to mean disobedience to any rules.
Right, but it's more about self-governance, because there's a bit of a contradiction there. You're trying to tell me that someone like Donald Trump is competent enough to lead an entire country. Spoiler alert, no, he's not. But you can't show that normal human beings down there, working class people, can't collectively self-govern. I don't believe that. People self-govern most of the time. It's the only time, you know, governmental or state bodies are even introduced is when it's time to pay your taxes, or, you know, if there's a disturbance, which, if there's a disturbance and the police get called, they're probably going to do a much worse job than a community crisis team would do anyway. And because oftentimes, and I've seen this a lot when I was homeless, somebody would be having a mental health crisis and there's a cop getting them in a headlock. Definitely not helping the situation, right?
No.
No, because more often than not, if that situation were to happen in, say, like a commune, first of all, the person's socioeconomic state is never going to fall to the point where he feels the need to prey on his neighbor in any way. You know, you eliminate a lot of potential for crime just by meeting people's basic needs in a bottom-up fashion. Because most people who commit crimes... Sorry, go ahead, Terzia.
No, I was going to say, talking about anarchy, and even terms like communism and socialism, and even terms like democracy, we use those words, and in society, over decades, those words have been given, or somehow they acquired a certain meaning. And when one looks back at the origin of the term, then one often realizes that's not how it's being used. And I think anarchy is a very good example of that, because I'm vaguely familiar with an article that Noam Chomsky wrote some years ago about anarchy. And Chomsky was basically also, well, I don't know if he's passed on, but
he's still around.
He's still around.
But he's very ill, and I think the last time I saw he's not able to communicate anymore. But nevertheless, he describes himself as an anarchist. And the mainstream idea of anarchy is chaos, total chaos, people running around the streets and no control, and it's just terrible. But that's not what anarchy means if one goes back to the original meaning. Very much like communism is the idea that most people have of communism is Stalinist Russia. While yes, but also really no.
No, that was state capitalism, even by Marx and Engels' definition. And you've got, Terzia, you've got Albert Einstein's face on the wall behind you, and he was a socialist.
Yes, but people don't understand, particularly in America.
Right. In America, they poison the well against anything that isn't imperial capitalism. Because those are the people that have all the money and all the power. So they're going to use boots, they're going to use guns, they're going to use whatever.
There's a lot of people who don't distinguish between socialism and communism.
Right.
Yeah.
Socialism
It's one of
is a exactly. It's a if I were to define each one of those in one sentence, I would say socialism is a society built around classlessness, regardless of whether or not there's still a state or whether or not there's still like currency in circulation. Whereas communism, and this is an interesting tidbit, you go back to the 1850s and communism and anarchism meant the same thing. They both meant a
yes,
classless, stateless society that used like direct resource barter instead of a fiat currency. Whereas
Mhm.
you know the last one isn't necessarily necessary in my opinion, because there's a lot of questions on how you're gonna handle the exchange of goods and services. Also, another thing that's really important when you're talking about anarchism and communism is they're not meant to be adjudicated across a landmass the size of the United States. Communism, per the name communism, is about communes, which are essentially the size of a neighborhood. And
Yeah.
anarchism is about the same. Basically, the idea is to have individual neighborhoods all be self-sufficient enough that they don't need um, to work 9 to 5s. You can get away with only working like 5 hours a day because you're not mass producing for the sake of an overconsumption paradigm. You're just making stuff people need to survive and then stopping for the day.
Mm.
And so, like, the dynamic is completely different. If you're dealing with supply side economics here in the United States, like, you know, like Milton Friedman style neoliberalism, the whole idea behind that is to try to monetize things that don't even need to be monetized just for the sake of extracting wealth and profit. And you know, then you look at like you know, this is kind of a side tangent, but like if you look at the life expectancy of working class people in the United States and compare that to other countries, you have no choice but to view a lot of the things beating down the working class here is almost like if I was a little bit more cynical and a little bit more of a conspiracy theorist, I would think that was a deliberate depopulation campaign,
Mm.
because I mean the life expectancies of working class people, particularly since the pandemic, have just nosedived.
Yes, they
And
have.
at the exact same time, a lot of the forced birther people here, you know, people who try to call themselves pro-life but happen to be pro everything that ends life and not really pro anything that promotes it. So I don't tend to call them actually pro-life because,
No, no,
you know,
no.
they just
They're
want,
they're, they're
yeah,
pro-birth. They're not.
pro-birth, right? They're pro-birth. And the reason they're pro-birth is because their depopulation campaign is actually making it harder to replace working class people and military grunts at an
Yeah.
acceptable level. So now they're going after reproductive rights, and everybody from JD Vance, what a jerk, to Elon Musk are sitting here complaining about birth rates. That's
Mm.
why they're complaining about birth rates. Musk wants to go to Mars and have, you know, servitors working there for him like he's the god emperor of Warhammer 40K. You know,
I wish
that's the,
go. Can't he just go to Mars? I mean, really, like,
yeah, he should
at
go on a
least
solo mission for about 10 years and let us know how
no,
it
no,
works
no, no,
out.
no.
We'd pay for him. We'd pay for him to do
He
that.
can
Yeah,
take Donald Trump with him. I mean, they can
that's
go
right.
together. They can take JD Vance as well. It doesn't have to be a solo mission.
Yeah, they can grab Stephen Miller. They can take a dude from Breitbart with them. I forget his name. Bannon.
I could give them at least 20 names just of the.
Yeah,
Maybe
Narendra
they could go.
Modi.
Absolutely, yeah, no. They could have a fantastic time. But just in the last minute, I want to ask you, Philip, what do you do for fun?
What do I do for fun? Well, this is probably the obvious autism answer, but I play a lot of video games. But recently I've been sort of coming out of my burnout period that lasted for like 35 years. And a lot of it is because of medicinal cannabis, and I was taking Wellbutrin for, I think, no, it's Zoloft. I was taking Zoloft for a while, but I ended up going off of it. But yeah, I'm probably going to be trying to work on developing my comedy. I was even gonna dabble with like making Muppets and using it to
Oh,
make fun of using Muppets to make fun of powerful people. Because
yeah,
I grew up with Jim Henson of
yes.
Sesame Street fame as like a third parent. Okay, like I was one of those neurodivergent kids that you basically put in front of a TV with PBS running and let that raise me instead of having to actually do it yourself. So yeah, I love science. I love communicating. I love philosophy. I really want to get my voice heard because I feel like I have a lot of valuable experiences that are especially relevant in the current age coming up.
Well, good luck with that. We thoroughly
Thank you.
enjoyed that idea, and I'm afraid we've run out of time.
Thank you for having me on, y'all. I'd love to do it again sometime if you're interested.
Great. Well, you're not the only person who said that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
Well,
thanks,
thank
Phil. Thanks,
I
Tercia.
say, John.
Thank,
Thank you,
thanks,
Philip.
viewers.
it's been nice meeting both of you, John and Terzia. It's been fun. I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank
Well,
you.
it's bedtime now for us in South Africa. I'm
Yeah, yeah.
going to bed now.
Nighty night.
Thank
Spoiler
you.
alert:
Bye.
the world is round.
Yes.
Ooh.